So the case of Winkie Irvine it's an incredible case, I suppose, and it's managed to cause a huge complications, I think, for the police, for the government, and just how the whole system operates. Um, and the latest we hear is that he seems to have been Winston Irvine has been at least kicked out of the UVF. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, well, I think the terminology they use is expelled, but I mean, people get a good laugh when I tell you that they expel people for bringing them into disrepute. You have an organisation responsible for hundreds of murders over the years, linked to crime and extortion, all sorts of other things. But don't mess around and you're bringing them into disrepute. And it's a mad story because I think that I am so used to people who operate like this in the part of the world that I work in. And we have independent reporting commission releasing reports every year that say there's too cosy a link between loyalist paramilitaries and members of the government, of the Northern Ireland office, of the state, of the structures. There's too much funding goes towards them. And they say this every year. People like me say it. We talk about the gatekeepers in the loyalist community that take hundreds and hundreds of thousands, millions of pounds of funding over the years intended for those communities and directed towards themselves. But nobody's ever listened. Nobody really cares because that's just how the system works. And then you have a case like this that is so stark and shows it, I think, and it's so glaringly obvious what's going on that people just can't ignore it anymore.
Well, just to remind us of the case, because basically Winkie Irvine he's been referred to as being a commander of a brigade of the UVF, and he's obviously been involved in peace talks over the years, but ultimately he's currently in prison after being caught with a handgun.
Well, he was caught with three weapons and some British Army ammunition in the boot of his car. Some of the people listening might remember, if we go back to the sort of Brexit disturbances that went on, Simon Coveney was visiting Belfast in 2022. He was giving a talk at the John and Pat Hume Foundation, and the UVF hijacked a van, placed what was a very elaborate hoax bomb in the back of it. The poor driver, obviously terrified, he didn't know it was a hoax bomb, told it to drive it up to the Hubin Centre where Simon Coveney was speaking. There is images you can see online of Simon Coveney's personal protection officer coming over and whispering in his ear, and he's whisked out of the place. So the chief constable at that time later said that this was a UVF operation, and it came from the Shankill, from B Company of the UVF based on the Shankill Road. Winston Irvine was a member of that. At that point, there was a lot of discussions as to what was going on and how this was linked to Brexit tensions. But then a few months later, in the June of 2022, uniformed police officers see some suspicious activity taking place on the Shankill. They see one man unloading, opening a van. A bag is moved from the van into the boot of a car. They stop the car in, I think it was Disraeli Street in the Shankill, and it's Winston Irvine's car, and in the back of it is a holdall, and it contained a handgun. I think it was the other two weapons had their weapons, which had originally been air rifles, but they can modify them so they can fire live rounds, and a load of ammunition. He's arrested, and almost immediately you could tell this case wasn't going to run the way normal cases are run. So first of all, he was denied bail in the magistrate's court, puts in for high court bail. The day of the High Court bail, everyone goes in the judge's chambers, which doesn't usually happen, and then they all come back out, and then his defence lawyer says, this man is involved in the peace process, and he has, references from government ministers, and he's studying peace studies in Maynooth, which, by the way, was being funded by the Irish government. So anyone listening to this, it's still paying off your student debt. All you needed to do was join a paramilitary organisation, and you have no student debt. Somebody paid for you to go and do all the degrees you want. So they said that there was a statement coming. It was of utmost importance to us all. The whole of Northern Ireland needed a statement in terms of the peace process and this great work that this fellow was doing. So he was released on bail with zero conditions, no tag, no curfew, no ban on using the phone or who you could speak to or not, just let out without any conditions at all. And he remained on bail throughout that, claiming he was saying he was going to plead not guilty. He had a paid job with a group called Intercom, which is funded, which is actually like the Republicans, but Winston Irvine had worked for them for quite some time and across community bases. They sacked him, and he threatened to take them to a tribunal. But within weeks, this was settled behind closed doors, whatever happened. And Winston then gets a job with ACT, which is like a loyalist restorative justice program. During his time on bail, and when I say this to normal people who don't live in my world, they gasp. during his time on bail, he organised an event in a hotel in Belfast. It was in relation to a cultural diversity programme linked to Loyalist band culture, and two senior police officers showed up at that event in a hotel, and Winston gets on the stage and introduces and thanks the police for attending. Now, can you imagine if this was someone who was linked to dissident republicanism, who was on bail for weapons offences, and decided to have an event which he was being paid public money to hold, and two cops show up at that event?
I mean,
all of this was portrayed as normal.
Yeah, it is. It is incredible. I mean, it's the equivalent of the Canadian cartel, hosting a retirement for a police officer or something like that. Because, of course, the UVF are not just an historical paramilitary group. They're in every one of those reports you name. You will hear about them being involved in extortion, drug dealing, taxing drug dealers. I mean, these are operating at the highest level of criminality, maybe sometimes with one step off. But I mean, the funny thing about the North, and because I work for the Sunday World, we cover these stories. There's all sorts of these grey areas. For example, if somebody is getting harassed and they go to the police in their home, if they're being subject to intimidation, the police in some ways consult with the paramilitaries to see if they're genuinely under threat. I mean, it's bizarre, is it not?
You get people under threat, and they'll say, have came to me and said, well, the police told me you basically not reporting that, you'd end up having to leave here, or well, you basically go and speak into X-Man said they could probably sort that out for you, and all sorts of areas. If there's disturbances on the street, you'll see senior police officers in the ear of paramilitaries, asking them to basically go and calm things down for them. And all of that's been pointed out in reporting commission reports that say, if you normalise this kind of activity between police officers and paramilitaries, well, if you're someone living under the jackboot of these organisations, so every now and then the Department of Justice, under the Tackling Paramilitaries programme, issues these big glossy adverts, don't borrow money from paramilitary money lenders and all this. But at the same time, if there was a disturbance linked to a rat or an interface, the same paramilitaries who are lending the money are standing whispered in the ears of cops at that interface. And this is all just seen as normal. Would you feel confident if you live in one of those areas going reporting something to a police officer who you knew was on first name terms with the guys who were threatening you, who had his personal phone number, who that person had the cop's personal phone number, who is talking to him on a regular basis? And that's what happened here. So Winston Irvine had what they call a preliminary inquiry, where he tried to get, no bill, where he tried to get these charges thrown out. And as part of that hearing, he claimed that the Deputy Chief Constable and himself, now this Deputy Chief Constable was an Assistant Chief Constable at this time, now a Deputy Chief Constable, were in constant contact, and he had phoned him, and he had a missed call, and then the cop phoned him back, and there was a missed call, and then he phoned him, and the inference being that Winkie was going to take these weapons and give them to the cops in some sort of unofficial decommissioning process. Now, it was a complete and utter nonsense. The police rubbished that. The judge didn't accept that, and the whole thing was going to go to trial. But it shows the fact that he even had that paper trail of phone calls between himself and this police officer allowed him to even attempt to try and ring that defence. Now, during this time while he's on remand, I'm at an event with a senior Irish government official who said, "Oh no, I haven't given up hope on Winston. I think we could still, rehabilitate him." And I'm like, "What does it take? He's got guns in a car. What does it take before you realise you're being hoodwinked?" And a lot of this is to do with laziness. And I say this time and time again. You have officials who come from a different world. They live in some lovely middle-class closeted society. And Winston Irvine comes along and charms the life out of them and tells them he can do this and he can deliver this, that, and the other. And rather than get up off their asses and go into those really hard-hit working-class communities and speak to the women and speak to the youth workers, they just insist that every single project is channeled through a paramilitary. And Winston Irvine had his hands in every pocket. In the women's, the Tackling Paramilitaries programme, he was being funded to deliver programmes for that. I mean, this is a man who is the paramilitary. And we used to say some of these people are community workers by day and paramilitaries by night. I think he was a paramilitary by day too. It was broad daylight when he was running around with a boot full of guns. He wasn't even, the whole thing was such a grey area. Come December last year, he all of a sudden said he was going to plead not guilty, has all this defence lined up, and the next thing you know, there's a guilty plea. Himself and his co-accused, Robin Workman, who was the guy who'd been driving the van, they plead guilty, and there's a number of different delays to the sentencing. Some of it linked to the barristers for striking, the criminal barristers. And then there was another very strange hearing in which he was meant to be sentenced, but the judge came out and said, "Oh, I've been made aware that the defence have applied for disclosure that could have some sort of impact on my sentence." And I'm baffled by this, because I have been reporting on crime for over 20 years, and you apply for disclosure as part of your defence before trial, not after you've pleaded guilty. What disclosure could make you less guilty than a guilty plea?
So
that was then never mentioned again. Then when the sentencing does happen, if I didn't know what I was listening to, I would have thought he was the second coming of Gandhi and Nelson Mandela and Kofi Annan and the whole lot put together. I mean, in fact, you would wonder how we had a peace process without him. I mean, single-handedly, he appeared to have delivered the peace. But this is the interesting thing, and this was obviously, I reported this about a week or so before the sentencing, that the prosecution had decided not to prosecute him under terror provisions. So there are terror provisions which were introduced by the British government, mainly to tackle Islamic terror and the outcry and the Daily Mail and things like that about lenient sentences for people who were involved in those lone wolf terror attacks in England. But what they mean is, if you're prosecuted under the terror legislation, you get your tariff, you get your jail time, and instead of being entitled to 50% remission, you have to serve 2/3, and even at that point, the parole commissioners have to meet with you and decide whether you should be allowed out. So it's a longer sentence regardless. Suspended sentences aren't available under terror provisions. They can also then install an order after you're released, which several dissident Republicans are currently under those orders, which means they can't cross the border. So Thomas Mellon, who I think we talked about in this podcast before, if he lives in Derry and if he wanted to cross the border into Donegal where the petrol's cheaper to fill up his car, he would have to give the police 2 weeks notice before he would do that. If you go on holiday, you have to give them 2 weeks notice. If you change your phone number, you have to tell them. But they decided not to prosecute him and said that the test for prosecution, and the PPS are getting really antsy about this and sending out all these letters saying, just because, the Sunday newspapers would ever name someone as a terrorist doesn't mean we can prove it. And I'm like, are you bloody serious? Do you know what they could have used to prove that Winston Irvine was a terrorist and a member of the UVF? His own references.
Yeah.
Because his references to the court, which made the court say that he was so extraordinary, and they used the word extraordinary, that he didn't have to serve the minimum time. He only had to serve half the minimum time and then half of that again in prison. So around 15 months with time done on remand, just over a year in prison for having, a boot with quite a considerable amount of weapons in it. And some of those references, my colleague Sam McBride applied to the court and received those references. And they speak about him being involved in the UVF decommissioning process, which you or I couldn't do. You had to be in the UVF to be involved in the UVF decommissioning process.
Yeah, they didn't ask for my opinion, all right. And of course, this is the other thing, Alison, as well. Like Thomas Mellon, when he was up in court, he didn't have these references from the great and the good, but Winston Irvine had, and these were references, as you said, that they tried to keep quiet as well. They didn't want said publicly until Sam McBride got them under Freedom of Information, I believe.
Yes, he applied to the judge, and the judge, in all fairness to him given, now there is currently a case ongoing where there has been an application by the media for the body-worn CCTV on the day that the two were arrested. The police are objecting, and the PPS are objecting to that being released to the media, and there's going to be a hearing to decide whether that will be the case. But Sam applied to the court for the references. The judge handed them over. Some of the references state that the people don't want them made public. But, you have people like Harold Good, a minister. You have people like Jim Ruddy, who has worked in reconciliation in Derry for a long time. You have Kieran McAvoy, he's an academic at Queen's. You have, David Campbell, a former UUP advisor, who is now the chair of the LCC. There was also a bundle of letters thanking him from people who, like Conor Burns, who was an ex, a Tory minister. And talk about how his reconciliation work at Lambeth Palace in terms of what he represented there. Well, he represented the UVF at Lambeth Palace. He represented the UVF in decommissioning. And his references also said he was involved in the UVF sort of transition process, trying to move them away from their military structures. And again, you can't just walk off the street and do that. You have to be in the UVF. So I still fail to understand the reason and the continuing, arguing with us in the media that there was no way they could prove he was in the UVF. It was very obvious what we were dealing with. Peter Taylor, the journalist, named him as being a man in a UVF mass reading a statement in a Spotlight programme about I don't know, about 10, 15 years ago. He never bothered challenging that because it was clearly obvious that it was him. And, over the years, there's other various incidents which have linked him to the UVF, but for whatever reason, they chose not to. When others who are caught for lesser crimes have been done
Of
under
course, I
those
mean,
terror provisions.
people are being done for having banners or flags, which I think there was a feature of that in that case as well.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that can be.
Oh, there was UVF paraphernalia in his house. There was a balaclava and all sorts of like UVF emblems and some sort of plaque on a wall and all sorts of other things. But apparently, none of that counted. It doesn't mean anything because we could all have that in our house, couldn't we?
Well, we could, I suppose, if you wanted to. But so, I mean, I suppose a lot of what he is, Winkie Irvine, comes out of obviously the Good Friday Agreement. And in the aftermath of the Good Friday Agreement being signed, there was this pot of money made available between the British and the Irish government to transition paramilitaries away from the paramilitarism. But of course, that was however many years ago. Is that money still floating around, and when does the transition become complete, I suppose, is the real question. And if there's not an end date, are we just going to continue are we effectively bribing people to stay out of trouble?
It's just legalized extortion, in my opinion. I mean, that's all it is. You don't have to extort a business. You can just go and say, well, there's going to be a rat at that interface, but if you give me money, I'll take a load of kids away go-karting or whatever it is, and then they'll all be fine. And the facilitation fees and the amount of funds that are channeled through that are extortion. If you see the money that actually goes through these programs, like the Tackling Paramilitarism project has actually had some really good successes. I can think off the top of my head that run a project with people who'd been the victim of paramilitary style shootings up around the northwest, up around Derry and Strabane, and that was really successful. But even the money that was meant to go towards women's groups, some of that was deflected off into paramilitary style organisations. But you do have other groups that are independent, like the Falls Women's Centre and the Shankill Women's Centre, who ploughed on regardless of what's going on around them and delivered amazing work. But it's the what I keep saying, it's the gatekeepers, the people like Winston Irvine, and he's not alone. There's others like him who are doing exactly the same thing. Nothing will happen without us. So if you want into this community, you want to do work with the women, you want to do work with the children, you want to run an education project, you want to run a youth project, you come to me. If you don't come to me, it's not happening. And that's basically what they were doing.
So to come full circle, like how has he brought the UVF into dispute? Is it his contacts with the police? Is it his bad publicity? Or we don't obviously get a report published?
Well, it's my understanding that there was an internal UVF investigation into what Winston was doing, because he was telling the leadership of the organisation one thing while he was then telling other people another thing. So, for instance, the Coveney bomb, which was obviously by big company of the UVF, of which he's a member, he was then down meeting representatives of the Irish government and blaming that on renegade loyalists. It's the pressure we're coming under from, the East Belfast UVF, say, the South East Antrim UVF, and if you just moved on them, this would all be ready. He was doing all this unauthorised without any behind people's back. There was the amount of money that he was creaming from various rackets and not telling anyone. He lives a very nice lifestyle. And there's other things that we'll probably never be privy to in terms of people who have been captured with weapons, people who have been sent to prison over the years for activity that now that there is a suspicion, given the fact that it seems impossible to put Winston in jail for anything that he does. There's clearly a lot of suspicion on him. I wonder now, does he wonder, would it have been better not showing up with a fistful of references and just taking his medicine and doing his time instead of having the whole world talking about what on earth is going on here? To the point where at the policing board meeting on Thursday, the Deputy Chief Constable Bobby Singleton had to say, I did not give this man a reference, nor would he have given him a reference. And by the way, we arrested both of them under terrorism legislation. It wasn't us. We did our job. He didn't criticise the PPS, but he basically said we did our part. What happened after that wasn't anything to do with us. So, and he's admitted that this has had a really damaging effect on public confidence in police and justice, as it has, because people are watching for anyone who's caught with even any kind of similar crime. I mean, you have dissident Republicans going to prison for, marching around in uniforms at Easter, and then you have, and being put under the terror provisions, having those restrictive provisions put on them when they're released from prison. And then you have, it's seemingly, untouchable and gilded Winston. Now, he is on the what we call a separated wing of Maghaberry Prison. So Maghaberry Prison's our only top security prison, and it has, much like Portlaoise, it would have like a landing that would be, so Bush House is where the Loyalist prisoners are, and he is on that. But he has now been moved on from the UVF. That means when he comes out, he won't have that protection, and he certainly then won't be able to go to various governments and go, I can deliver X, Y, and Z. So it does put an end to his very lucrative career, albeit very late in that career. But the question is, will he be allowed to remain on that Loyalist wing? Some would argue, look, regardless of whether he's thrown out, he needs to stay on it for his protection because he wouldn't be safe in the main prison population. But others would say, well, then send him to solitary. He can go to the punishment block and stay there, given the fact he doesn't have that much time to do anyway, because, he's so exceptional.
Well, it could only happen in Northern Ireland, and it's only every now and again you come across a case that really brings up the real contradictions in the system. So, yeah, he would have maybe been better taking that extra 12 months.
He would have, and sometimes I think, some of this becomes so normalised to me, and because of my work, and it's only when I speak to people who sometimes I'm jealous, and I'm sure you are too. Of people, your mates who do normal jobs and they're oblivious to all this. And wouldn't you think sometimes, wouldn't it be lovely if you didn't know any of this?
Well,
if none of this lived in your head and you just went to work every day and did your 9 to 5 and come home and didn't have to concern yourself about the Kinahans or the UVF or anyone else.
Well,
when I
first started doing the North stuff, like for the Sunday World, I'd always think the government won't be doing that because they probably wouldn't do it down here. But then after a while you realise, oh yeah, they quite.
The Irish government were as complicit in Winston Irvine's rise to popularity as anyone else, and that lovely fancy house they have in Notting Hill in South Belfast. I mean, he was a regular visitor up there, swanning around with a glass of wine in his hand like he's some sort of dignitary.
I don't know. And he was even off to Afghanistan, which he didn't solve the problems over there either, did he? He did actually.
I don't know how. Maybe it's because they don't have a load of peace funding that he could claim. If they had it, maybe he would have been able to stay and sort it out for them.
Well, maybe so. Well, look, we'll come back to him again, no doubt, Alison, because it's just a fascinating story. Thanks very much.
I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.